Welcome to another episode of Tabadlab Live. Today we're joined by Toby Dalton, who is a scholar of nuclear security and of geopolitics. He's based at the Carnegie Endowment for International Peace, and he's recently written a fascinating piece on the juxtaposition of the old and the new normals in South Asia, using the Balakot attack that happened last year in February 2019, and that really alarmed a lot of people all around the world, but especially as somebody living in Pakistan, and those that I know here in Pakistan who were and across the border in India, many millions of people who were very concerned that the situation had the potential to escalate beyond any kind of threshold that we'd ever experienced before. Tensions between Pakistan and India are not new, but the Balakot episode is seen by a lot of commentators and observers in Pakistan as a new normal. And I think Toby's piece challenges that notion. And I thought we all here at the Tabadlab thought it would be fantastic to get Toby on and to get him to maybe walk us through, his primary thesis in this piece. Welcome him to the Tabadlab and thank him for his scholarship on what we think, quite for obvious reasons, is one of the most important areas and geopolitical contexts in the world. Thanks for joining us, Toby.
Well, thanks for having me. I appreciate the opportunity to come on and talk through these issues.
Great. Why don't you start off by just because we live in the TLDR era, and I know that lots of folks are going to be interested in watching, but would not have read the piece. Talk us through what the central thesis is, and then I'll start firing away some friendly blanks in terms of questions.
Fair enough. Well, like you, sitting in Washington in February of 2019, I also was very concerned about the potential that the kind of back and forth between Pakistan and India after the Indian purported strike at Balakot could escalate very significantly, could potentially lead into a situation where there could be major war, potentially the use of nuclear weapons, which is kind of the lens through which I look at a lot of these issues. And no doubt, I think the concern that was felt by Pakistanis and Indians was shared in Washington and other capitals as well. So I have been thinking about that concern and what motivated that concern in the 15 months since that episode, and wanted to try to parse through a little bit kind of how I've been thinking about it, and also to try to empathize with how people in the region have been seeing the events since that time. And what I observed was that at that time, you had this sort of crossing of important thresholds in that episode, particularly with the use of air power. And that was new in the nuclear era in South Asia, and that seemed particularly escalatory. And after that, you had also a lot of rhetoric in India, and then actions that were taken by the Modi government subsequent to its re-election that I think reinforced for people in Pakistan the sense that it wasn't just a singular incident, the Balakot attack, but was perhaps part of a new pattern of a more aggressive India that would challenge Pakistan's integrity in important ways. And so that was kind of my orientation to this problem was, is that really the case? Do we see evidence, in fact, that there is a new normal established, a new paradigm established after the Balakot attack? And I think where I come down on that question is maybe not so much, and for a couple of reasons. And I'd like to say, I hope I'm right about this. I don't wish more escalatory crisis or conflict on the region. There's enough challenges to go around these days, and we don't need another conflict on top of that.
No, so I think that that position is clear in the piece, and I think it's going to be discussed far and wide here in Pakistan, because I think the conventional wisdom here in Pakistan is that there is something fundamentally that has changed because of what you mentioned, the sort of the aerial nature of the attack or the intervention that India chose to engage in. it essentially hadn't happened in 50 years. The last time that had happened was in 1971 when planes were crossing the border. I think even more alarming from a not a pacifist perspective, but one that, my own perspective on this, obviously being very heavily invested in normalization between the two countries, fully cognizant and very favorable as far as the Pakistani positions are concerned, but also understanding and comprehending that especially the 2008 attacks in Mumbai really make it very difficult to normalize the relationship. So you take all of that into account, but you look at Balakot and it really, even for me, it alters the dynamic between the two countries, because it essentially says that India can engage in this cross-border military activism without the kind of sanction that would meet another country doing the same thing in a different context. And I understand all of the counter arguments, right? We're naturally going to talk about the LET and the JEM. We're going to talk about UNSC 1267. But in a sense, those are secondary because they're technical in nature to the kinetic nature of the attack. After the first day, when the Indian plane went down, I think was an even more worrisome. I mean, obviously, from a flag waving perspective, it was great that the Pakistani Air Force demonstrated the capacity to fend off that kind of attack. But it's really scary that a plane could go down in that way, and that essentially we're in the middle of a POW situation within 24 hours with an entire nation of over 1 billion people baying for blood because one of their pilots has gone down. Did you? I mean, obviously you don't ignore this because I know how thoughtful you are, and you've thought through all these issues. But that dimension of when you escalate, you cannot predict how many planes are going to go down, what side of the border they're going to go down, how they're going to be treated on the other side. I mean, it was a miracle in my books that he survived the crowd that gathered around him. So when those things were happening, we felt a certain way. But now, with a little bit of distance, I'm reading your piece and your position as kind of maybe discounting the insanity or the unpredictableness of that moment. Am I being harsh?
No, and look, there are contested narratives around that event and what it means, and so it will be interpreted differently in Pakistan than it is in India, than it is in elsewhere. And so part of what I'm trying to do is understand those narratives and where they join and where there's some disjuncture. So I think that we have to recognize the importance of luck, sheer luck, in how that crisis evolved. It could have gone differently. It could have, there could have been fatalities, hundreds of fatalities potentially in the Indian airstrike. The Pakistani counterstrike could have ended up not hitting open ground, but intentionally or accidentally hit something else. So there are multiple points at which the crisis could have gone other directions. One part of the crisis that I've been fascinated by, and which has not yet been, I think, thoroughly explored, is the rumors of missile threats that were made, and I'm not sure what to make of those, whether those were real rumors, etc. But I think that one is a really important one in thinking about potential thresholds for escalation. But now looking at it with this 15 months of hindsight, what can we say? Well, you had a pattern in India since 2002, all the way through until 2016, of not responding whenever there was some perceived provocation from that originated in Pakistan, shall we say. And you might view that as actually an abnormal situation, that other countries would not have had that record of restraint. And so we're comparing 2016 and 2019 against that record of restraint. And so therefore anything that is not that restraint looks unusual. So that's kind of point one. Point two I would make is that even though we have to accept the role of luck, you still also have to recognize that the Indian strike that they attempted was very calibrated, right? It was at a specific target. It was a not military target. It was not in a populated area. That showed, I think, a lot of care taken to think through about potential escalation. It was a lot less than people in India were calling for, right? You had analysts and commentators in India calling for cold start. You had people arguing that you should go after Maridke, much more sort of significant, symbolic, and potentially high casualty targets. So that's point two, that there was this kind of care taken in the targeting. And if you look at, sort of setting the rhetoric aside after that, India, I think, also wanted to de-escalate. I mean, again, the missile strike or the missile threats I found interesting and puzzling and still do. But I think that you saw an impetus to de-escalate, that the kind of PR victory had been sufficient in India. Most significantly for me, though, is that you look at the record of things since then. And, over a summer in which Pakistan was warning of potential false flag attacks that India could use as some kind of cover to launch a more aggressive action against Pakistan, in the context of Indian politicians saying, first Kashmir, now, AJK is next, right? So I think in that context, you still don't see a more militarily aggressive India. There has been no Balakot 2.0, right? You don't see that kind of level of hostility. What you see, in fact, is kind of a return to the old, cross-border shelling. Yeah, some differences, and I don't mean to discount that. It's terrible for the people who are affected in those areas. I think it's not healthy for two militaries to be in some kind of constant interaction like that. And there's always some risk of escalation. And yet, that's kind of the familiar form of low-level conflict. And then on top of that, you have a lot of rhetorical heat given to this notion of new normal, particularly in India. But I think a lot of that heat is implied. It's sort of it's machismo, it's bravado. It's not, really careful marrying of tactics and strategy to have some long-term deterrent effect. And you see hawkish commentators in India saying this, that Modi is not really carrying out the new paradigm. He's not sustaining the new paradigm. It was kind of a, one-shot crisis, and that Pakistan hasn't learned its lesson. And therefore, if Modi was really serious about this, you should do more. Every time there's one of, some provocative incident, India should be doing another Balakot. So I think you kind of look at all of that evidence, and it suggests to me that there isn't as much there in the new normal as might have seemed like it was there in February of 2019, when the kind of emotion and worry was so prevalent at that time. Kind of made it harder, I think, to kind of separate out these various strands of the argument.
I guess I'm still convinced, and I think, perhaps we're going to have to agree to disagree on this, but, I'm still convinced that the fact that cross-border action was, in many ways, it was validated by the US, the UK, Germany, France, and Australia. I thought, the strongest and most surprising statement, in my view, was actually the one out of Germany. We expected something out of France. There's many reasons for that. You follow the military hardware sales game as well as any of us do, and those are obvious. There's a strategic reason for the U.S. to be engaged in the way that it does, and I want to come back to that in a little while. But I wanted to maybe push one last time. Look, now that the Indians have essentially gotten away with upping the ante like this, the minimum threshold for the next time they are pushed or feel compelled to do something is Balakot. Like a diet Balakot will not do. And to me, that in and of itself represents a new normal, because it has fundamentally altered the nature of the dynamic across the border. Until Balakot, this so-called surgical strike, which is deeply contested even within India, and I know in DC and London as well. There's varying narratives about how much of a surgical strike there really was. I believe in 2016. Uh, Notwithstanding that, I think there's a real change now that is not going to be easy for the Indians to walk back. You disagree?
Let me make 2 points here. First, to kind of go back to what I had suggested earlier, the change is striking because it is a change against a situation that was also in itself unusual. That India was restrained in 2008, that India opted not to retaliate in 2008, and in subsequent, lower level attacks, I think it was an unusual situation. And I think that bred some perception, perhaps in India, perhaps in Pakistan, perhaps elsewhere, that space for this kind of low level, more than cross-border shelling, but not cold start, not significant air campaigns, that space was closed, that it didn't exist. But I guess my contention is that space was always there. It was that for a variety of reasons, Indian politicians at the time opted not to use military means to retaliate. And so, yes, that's different, right? There is a new situation now where you have an Indian leadership that is willing to use some limited military means to retaliate. So that's point one. Point two, even though there is that space, within that space, I think there's a lot more concern than might be apparent from Indian rhetoric. I don't see how a major conflict that India can't win, or for that matter, Pakistan can't win, how that serves the electoral interests of either leadership. I think for Modi, being able to thump his chest and to control the narrative that the surgical strikes were a great victory and the Balakot strike was a great victory is fine. Those were singular incidents. He's able to utilize his kind of mastery of media to shape those narratives and sustain them as great victories for India. That's a lot harder to do when bodies start to pile up, when you're starting to see significant economic and other kinds of effects from a major conflict. And so I kind of think that for India, the restraint that we saw before may be gone, but it is still there. And that restraint is shaped by electoral politics, by global aspirations, by economic realities, but also by the fact that India and Pakistan have nuclear weapons, and you can only go so far before the risks of nuclear weapons coming into play, accidentally or otherwise, are very real. Are nuclear weapons going to come into play from a Balakot strike? No. Could they come into play if things go wrong and there's subsequent escalation from there? Perhaps. But I think there's still a couple moves that have to come in there. And my sense is that, again, sort of setting aside the chest thumping and the rhetoric and the night of murder and these kinds of things that we heard in the election campaign, Indian leaders are still probably more rational and calculating than you might give them credit for. Now, I recognize that that's a view from Washington, which is thousands of miles away. And when you're right next door to a leader who is saying things and is acting in a way that is clearly threatening, it's harder to view those in kind of a less concerning way. That said, I live in Virginia, which is right across from Washington, D.C., where Trump lives. And so I share kind of, some of the concern about leaders next door who are doing things that are inimical to your interests.
Toby, I want to just explore the choice option here a little bit further, because I think there might be elements within the Pakistani strategic community that would respond to that by questioning whether or not it really was a matter of choice or whether there was an element of capacity as well. And it's not 0-1 in any situation, but maybe where we put the mark on the slider might be different. So, certainly until, I mean, you had Pathankot, you had Uri, you had other incidents between Mumbai and what you've seen in the last few years. In terms of a smoking gun or direct, attribution, the best case was actually Mumbai. Everything else is actually, the evidence is relatively thin. Now, I know that there's a lot of Indian friends and friends in DC who will take umbrage at that, but that's my position. It's a position I suspect is widely shared here in Pakistan with many folks. If, like, the question really is, was it really a choice that the Indians had been making previously, and what is the choice element now? I guess the key question is, what changed in India between everything before Pulwama, essentially, and after Pulwama? What is the foundational change? Some people would say that the only real change was that there was an election right around the corner, and Modi hadn't really delivered very much against his electoral promises. And that's why it's actually more worrisome for folks like me to see friends in DC and other places kind of, carte blanche this election related behavior by India, because the rhetoric not matching the behavior then becomes a real problem, because eventually the rhetoric and the behavior will begin to catch up, because the behavior in the case of Balakot, at least from one interpretation, was clearly in pursuit of a rhetoric meeting agenda, if that makes any sense. And so, the fact that you have half the Indian cabinet and the Indian chief making claims over Gilgit-Baltistan and AJK, openly basically threatening to take over Gilgit-Baltistan as recently as, I think it was 4 days ago, when Bipin Rawat last made a statement about this. How do you parse all of this, and how do you put it together?
As I said, there's these contested narratives, and the kind of view of what constitute facts or not facts is really hard. And so, that, as you said, the question of attribution to past attacks is a hard one. More important for me, I guess, and in particular, thinking about something you said earlier, which is the extent of international support that India received or sort of the lack of sanction around Balakot. I think that there's international perception that India is in its right to do retaliation, that other countries would retaliate, and there's some understanding of that. That said, there's also deep concern, I think, in the international community about the potential for escalation. I would imagine that even though there's some understanding of the Indian position, there's also going to be a lot of effort still, if there's another crisis like this, to encourage restraint. How effective that will be, I have no idea. In terms of what that means for how India would navigate something like this, whether the kind of the rhetoric, which I think is very much domestically oriented, then matches with military action and kind of international repercussions. There isn't a lot of evidence apart from Balakot to sort of tie these things together. And so I look at the last 15 months, and mostly I see rhetoric, some loose nuclear talk, which was abnormal, but also came during an election campaign. And so it's hard to know what to make of that. But that's kind of it, right? And so is it real? Is it bravado? Is it, it's difficult for me to disentangle. But where I come, I'm kind of the school that things change incrementally until there's some sharp change. And I just don't see this as a sharp change. Like, this is not a new equilibrium, a new normal, as it's been called. And I think for the obvious reasons that the Indian military can do certain things but you can only go so far before nuclear weapons come into play. And I think that recognition has been there in India. It's certainly there in Pakistan. And so then the contest is really, how do you shape perceptions about the potential for a crisis to go that far? For Pakistan, part of that is about shaping Indian perceptions as well as international perceptions, so that there would be pressure on India to be more restrained. In India, are they feeling more emboldened after Balakot, after the election, making these claims on Gilgit-Baltistan? I still think of this mostly as like domestic politics. It makes for good PR. And you don't see major changes in the military status quo. So India is now in another border spat with China. You can almost like set your egg timer to these things, right? Like it's kind of every 3 years or something like that. And it's kind of, it's at a different place. It's not Doklam, but it's still, handbags and stone throwing and shouting at each other and, claims to the territory. And it kind of reminds me of, two dogs growling at each other, but both recognizing they have very sharp teeth and deciding that it's better to sort of just growl and bark, but not to really go for the throat. And I think, frankly, that same consideration is there in thinking about major military action between India and Pakistan too. The teeth are there, and if both go for the throat, it's going to be catastrophic. And so therefore there has to be some measure of built-in restraint. In between that, there's going to be contact, right? And some of that contact might be really worrying. It might look like it's going to escalate. And as I said at the outset, I really hope it doesn't. I want to be right that there's not a sort of a new potential for major crisis here. So anyway, that's kind of how I've organized my thoughts around this issue.
I mean, I think it'd make a fascinating case study. One of my favorite, I think probably for me personally, one of my, one of the seminal texts in my life has been Thomas Schelling's, it's a series of lectures. It's not really a book per se, but Micromotives and Macro Behavior. And I think before Douglas North, I think Schelling had me hooked on incentives and how they shape macro, meso, micro, and nano behavior. I think that's, I mean, frankly, I'm always also looking for like new sort of fun research projects. And I think it'd be fascinating to look at the level of rhetoric in Indian politics and actually track back as far back as we can. My own memory goes back to, of course, 1998 and the nature and level of rhetoric, especially at that time from Lal Krishna Advani, who was a more substantial leader of the BJP than he is now. I mean, I think that old guard, they're all done. But I mean, what is your thought on this? Like from an academic standpoint, you study this stuff, day and night, and you live and breathe it. To what extent should nuclear policy and our understanding of how nuclear weapons are positioned and their stature within a society, how much of that can be or should be linked to kind of the new public discourse, the 21st century post-social media public discourse, in which so much of what ends up being reality starts out with people like you and me, kind of borderline boomers / Gen Xers, looking at that stuff and saying, nah, it's not serious. And then you open the paper 3 years later, and that troll is like a minister somewhere or a president somewhere. I'm not going to name any countries, but or a prime minister somewhere. How does all of this, the new discourse, fit into the way you think about nuclear security?
Yeah. I mean, look, obviously in Washington, we're not immune to the same phenomenon where there are threats made about big buttons and all kinds of things, straight from the White House. And so these are not idle things. Those buttons are connected to military chains of command that have capabilities behind them. And so there's always potential for things to go wrong. We're in a really interesting time at the moment from my perspective where, until 3 months ago, there were kind of two cataclysmic threats that were on the horizon. One, climate change, which will have catastrophic global effects, and it has a probability of one. That will happen. Now, there's going to happen over a long period of time, and there will be a lot of efforts to mitigate it and so forth. But the other one that could be globally catastrophic, but on a much shorter time frame, is nuclear war. And I think a lot of the public memory about nuclear war is gone. And I think if you now were to ask people to organize their threat priorities, nuclear weapons are even less now, considering the pandemic, than they were before. And yet this remains the only thing that could, within a matter of hours, kill off huge portions of humanity. So I think it's a strange time to be working on and thinking about these issues, where the narratives, the public perception, and the realities really don't match up. And where they do match up, or where they come into the most tension with each other, are around things like Balakot. Was that a nuclear crisis? I think this is something that the analytic community is also thinking about. And I have great respect for colleagues in Pakistan, officials, other think tank analysts who have kind of made arguments about the nuclear nature of this crisis. The Director General of ISPR at the time made some allusions to it being a nuclear crisis. General Kidway, the retired Strategic Plans Director General, he gave a speech some months ago in which he said that this was also kind of a nuclear crisis, and that India was flirting with the nuclear threshold and carrying out the airstrikes. Because nuclear weapons aren't usable, all of this is kind of theater in some way, right? It's both theater and theology. It's kind of a religious morality play, and so we all get to decide which of these things we believe to be true. Is it really the case that nuclear weapons deter anything and everything, or is it really the case that nuclear weapons don't deter as much as people say they do, and therefore the threat of conflict is higher? There's really no evidence for this, and it comes down to what you believe. Militaries, as planning organizations, tend to be very conservative, and so they're going to want more. They're going to want them to be able to do a lot of different things. A lot of that ends up manipulating risk in ways that makes crises more dangerous. On the other hand, does it also mean that there's a less likely chance of escalating the war? Perhaps. So it's a really fascinating time to be looking at these questions and thinking about how nuclear weapons play into relations between countries, threat perception, etc. I can tell you a lot of people in Washington right now are focused on how the U.S.-China competition is growing, and what the nuclear dimension of that is going to look like, and whether it's possible to at some point arrive at a place where, notwithstanding their differences and the disparities in capability, there's some kind of arms restraint measure that could be negotiated with China. And I think a lot of it is driven by the recognition that nuclear weapons can't be used. If they are used, it is globally catastrophic, and therefore it's incumbent on governments and militaries to find ways to not use them, as it were. Which is, typically militaries think about using the weapons they have, not using them.
I want to go back to something, we've kind of, alluded to this in the conversation a couple of times so far, which is third-party mediation, or essentially, non-India, non-Pakistan actors in the room or just outside the room, nudging one or the other country in one or the other direction. On the question of Indian will versus capacity in terms of what changed, what was different about Balakot, one of the other theories, and again, I have I have a lot of time for this one, is that the nature of engagement of other countries, particularly the US, but not just the US, has changed it. So I already alluded to these 4 or 5, Western powers that I think decidedly took essentially a pro-India position and said, you know what, it's well within India's right to do this, which, frankly, from a Pakistani standpoint, for me and for many here, is appalling, because it really fundamentally alters the dynamic, and it's not a normal conventional dynamic. It is a nuclear dynamic. And you've covered all of this so far, but we've danced around the China question, and you mentioned the increased tension between India and China on the border, the increased competitive nature of the dynamic between the U.S. and China, not just on the economic front, but particularly on the technological frontier. And now with COVID-19 and many of the narratives that have emerged out of this global pandemic, a real nasty turn in terms of the way in which each country and their security establishments, for lack of a better term, would like the other country to be spoken about. In that context, I found it interesting that this is the time when tensions between India and China have reemerged. Out of where, I'm not quite sure. I'm not quite sure who instigated it, but it certainly serves as very convenient signaling at this time for India to demonstrate its problems with China in the wider context of the growing and, I think, sustained strategic alignment between the US and India. Now, if we connect this back to, let's say, 1998, 99, 2000, and the role that the US used to play in this region, would you agree that there has been a fundamental shift in the degree of robustness of US involvement as a objective, if not neutral, party in the region?
I think there are some really important changes. There are also some things that are continuous and are important. So nuclear weapons are continuous, and they will always catalyze outside interest and pressure when there is a crisis. I think, notwithstanding some of the kind of more not positive per se, but the sort of understanding given to India in taking the Balakot strike, reflected a couple different things: contemporary politics, commercial interests in India, etc. That said, there was also concern about the potential for escalation, and so I think a lot of what you heard from other countries was, yes, okay, go after terrorists, but don't get into a fight, right? But there are a couple other pieces to this that I think that are kind of in the change column that you alluded to, and that are worrying. As much as nuclear weapons might catalyze outside pressure and interest, the speed of crises is faster now. Most of the action, from the Balakot to the Pakistani retaliation to the shooting down of the MiG-21, that happened within a span of hours, right? That is not, there's not an opportunity for outside powers to really intervene when things are moving that quickly. Two, I think you see also from the United States two things over time. One, kind of less interest in South Asia over the last few years, less interest in, or kind of less appetite for the global cop role that American presidents have asserted for themselves over time. That's not just under the Trump administration. That's a trend that goes further back. And also, I would imagine, and understandably, a perception in Pakistan that the U.S. is not neutral on this question, and that even though the U.S. may not want to see escalation between India and Pakistan, the U.S. is not going to enter that in the same sort of neutral-oriented way that it might have done in decades past. So that is a change. China's role is also really interesting, and I just I think this is, for me, a big puzzle, and it's a puzzle without a lot of data because China is often a black hole on these kinds of things. And so, colleagues here in Washington have been working on this. I'm thinking Andrew Small and Dan Markey and others, people who are focused on kind of China in South Asia and what it means. And you can imagine different scenarios that might come into play in a crisis where, China leans on Pakistan to be restrained, or China threatens India with, some economic or other kind of pressure to encourage restraint, or it plays more of a arbitration role, or what have you. You can imagine those, and China's kind of positioned in some ways to do that. But then you also have this persistent tension between India and China. Periodically it flared at Doklam, and then you had the summit between Xi and Modi that kind of cooled things off, and there seemed to be some understanding and a return to comedy and a lot of investment. And the bilateral trade between them is hugely important to both countries, which I think is an important dampener. Yet India also doesn't want to be subject to Chinese economic suasion and kind of the use of economic integration as a weapon to threaten the Indian economy. And so I think that kind of, in the nationalist moment that India is in now, that is also of concern. And then you layer the border tensions on top of that. And so it's hard to imagine now an outside party, Washington, Beijing, not London, that could be
Moscow.
I mean, you tell me. It's Pakistan-Russia relations have warmed. Is there sufficient trust that Moscow has enough reach and sway in the Indian government that you would think that it would be a good conduit for trying to sort things out in a crisis?
Look,
perhaps.
My honest view on that is that whatever improvement there has been between Pakistan and Russia, and I think it's been huge. I think there's substantial progress on that relationship. Even if you look at the sort of posture of Gabalov in particular, there's a lot of alignment on some really key issues between Pakistan and Russia. But fundamentally, I think it's come at a cost, and the cost is I don't think that Russia and India have the same kind of relationship that they had 15 years ago. So yes, Russia is more important in Pakistan, but consequently, or maybe not consequently, independently, but it just doesn't have the same influence that it did in New Delhi, I don't think. I don't know what your take on that is.
That would be my guess as well. Arms sales don't amount to significant strategic influence, right? It's important, but it's not sufficient. So I guess just to kind of put a final point on that part of the conversation, I ultimately think that the solution to the sustainable, durable solution to this problem has to originate between India and Pakistan. You might be able to have outside powers help in a crisis. They may be helpful in other ways too, in structuring incentives and making them sustainable to resolve things. But ultimately, whatever situation you want to see emerge where there's a more durable, nonviolent relationship between India and Pakistan, that has to come from political impetus within the region. I wrote a book with my colleague George Perkovich called Not War, Not Peace, where we observe this kind of permanent condition that seems to be in place in the region now, with great tragedy that is the condition. And ultimately our conclusion was that unfortunately this condition seems to be stable. And you don't see the forces in either country sufficient to find a way out of this kind of deadly embrace that has taken hold.
So I think that's a perfect setup, and I'm glad you brought up the book, because I have it open right behind our screen right now, and I didn't want to get into because I think it's a book that should be read in its entirety, and I don't want to pick on one aspect of it, but I wanted to use the kind of subtitle and the branding exercise as an inflection point for the maybe. I think in many ways, maybe the most essential part of the discussion, which we haven't really gotten into yet. in the title, after the title, the intro says a comprehensive assessment of the violent and nonviolent options available to India to deter and respond to cross-border terrorism from Pakistan. Now, I know, George Perkovich, and I followed his work, followed your work for years. So I know for a fact that your actual take is dramatically more nuanced and better informed than many of us sitting in the region on what is the source of this terrorism. I understand, of course, that it's a 0-1 sum game, especially after 9/11, and we all have, especially in Pakistan, we have great clarity on terrorism as being a legitimate or not legitimate instrument of negotiation, and it is not legitimate. We all know this, and there's broad agreement. The government of Pakistan knows this. I think even some of the people intimately involved in some of the nastier pieces of work that have taken place over the last quarter century have known what the outcome of that pursuit, that direction of pursuit is, and yet in these teasers for a fascinating book like the one you've written with George, or in the general narrative, or even the wider discourse in South Asia, it seems to be an excruciatingly favorable treatment of India when we talk about this, because of course the other thing that has changed, and this is post Balakot, is that the normalization of Indian aggression. And again, this is my position. Obviously, I'm pretty sure you'll disagree with it. But the normalization of Indian aggression created the political oxygen for Modi to believe that August 5th was possible. And so what we have now is a Prime Minister Modi who feels not only that the behavior post Balakot or the Balakot strike itself was validated or valid, but also that the annexation of Kashmir on August 5th is also valid. Now, I'm going to present a scenario, and this is a long question, but you're kind to be patient. Let's say that the Pakistani security establishment has an epiphany, and frankly, I think that there has been an element of that brewing over the last decade anyway, and particularly over the last 4 years. The Pakistani establishment decides it just doesn't want to fight India anymore. Kashmir is, not winnable in any way. So rather than losing sleep and valuable political capital, which is very limited for Pakistan anyway, let's just agree on a settlement on Kashmir. Maybe LOC, maybe something different, but something akin to the kind of ongoing status quo as far as territory is concerned. Does anyone in Washington really believe that that'll actually solve the problem in Kashmir, given the 70 years of history there? And if not, given the cross-border nature of violent political expression or terrorism, there's no, even if Pakistan completely clamped down on some of their traditional groups that did have linkages to Pakistan once upon a time, like Jaish or others, the fact is that even if there was a complete clean break, unless the human condition in Kashmir and the sense of Kashmiri dignity is not addressed in some way, and I don't think August 5th is that way, how are we going to solve Kashmir? And therefore, how are we going to solve the nuclear question in South Asia? I know this is kind of like a lifetime's worth of work that I'm trying to pack into one question, but I really don't think that friends outside of Pakistan ever give Kashmir the centrality in this. Those groups, the LET and the Jaish, they came out of something and somewhere. And that something and somewhere is the problem in Kashmir. And I'm being very value neutral in how I'm talking about Kashmir, because I don't want, I want you to really be able to think about this and talk to us about this in a way that's fair, but that gives it the attention, at least that I think it probably merits and doesn't get.
So that's a lot to respond to, and let me try to sort through a couple different pieces of it. So first, just kind of walking back to how we chose the treatment in our book. At that time, a lot had been written kind of about the nuclear situation in South Asia, and we tried to understand in as kind of dispassionate a way as possible how this problem was being thought about and confronted in India. So I don't think that you would see I didn't consider it a favorable treatment of India. I considered it a thorough explanation of how Indians are thinking about this problem from their perspective. Right? So we tried to see it from their perspective. If there's fault in trying to see a problem from somebody else's perspective, then we have a problem there. The problem of impetus for peace and the role of actually, let me say one more thing. I think the connection between Balakot and August 5th is, I understand the argument about that connection, and in particular the role of the international community in giving a pass on Balakot being important, and also kind of creating the conditions that made August 5th possible. I don't know enough. Just I will be very clear and hopefully with humility say I don't understand enough kind of the domestic politics of Kashmir in India. My thinking is, and what I've heard is, that the plans for that long predated Modi's re-election, and that his re-election cleared the way to put those into place. Now, Balakot was clearly part of the campaign. Had he not been re-elected, clearly you don't get August 5th. Had Balakot not happened, would you still have August 5th? My guess is probably yes. And so I don't know how to kind of tease out those connections there. Okay, now jumping ahead to the harder question that you asked about, how do you resolve Kashmir? How do you resolve the nuclear situation? I don't think, it's, on the one hand, you can't do it with this political leadership in India. On the other hand, you have to find ways to do it with this kind of political leadership in India. And you don't get to choose your neighbors. Your neighbors are who they are. And, ultimately, whether it's, you build a taller fence and that's what makes peace, or, you find a way to talk more politely over the fence, or whatever it is. I think there's no easy solution. If there was an easy solution, it would have been, figured out in the last 70 years, and clearly it's not there. And so when I said that it's unfortunate, this current structure of this problem is stable, that's what I mean. I think there's the combination of political will, political risk acceptance, buy-in of civil society and security institutions, support from the international community, all of the factors that would have to be there to change the structure of the problem in a way that would allow for some sort of lasting peace just aren't there. I don't, my own view, I think like yours, is that territory is not going to change. It's very unlikely that it's going to change hands, which isn't meant to invalidate the rightness of the Kashmiri wishes for self-determination or otherwise. I mean, just as I would also note, however, that as much as Pakistan might support the Kashmiri cause, it'd be interesting to poll Kashmiris to see whether they would really want to join Pakistan, given the other kind of minority problems in Pakistan these days. So it's a really difficult challenge. I wish I had better ideas. I wish that my own government had more will to try to do something about this problem. When it has tried to do something about it in the past, it's been clear that has been rejected in India, and there you have it. So that's why I come back to the unfortunately tired and not very innovative position that the seeds of change have to come from within the region. Others can nurture those seeds, but ultimately, this is a decision that the people of India and the people of Pakistan have to make for themselves and for their future, and to realize that future would be better without persistent threat of violence.
Look, that's I think, as usual, with so many of these discussions that we have on this region in particular, we tend to end the discussions on a note of realism. I think nuclear folks tend to be a tad more realistic than others. But I'm still going to push my luck, and I'm going to ask you to maybe, when you look at the future, and you can feel free to point to anything you like. I think the nature of the ticket on both sides in terms of the U.S. election, I think, and the nature of U.S. strategic interests in the region kind of closed the door on the U.S. being any hope or any source of hope as far as a resolution. But what do you see within the region, maybe within India, within Pakistan, and not necessarily next week or next year or even the next 5 years, but maybe a bit longer term, in the next 5 to 10 years? What are the sources of hope that you can identify and see that will help bring the threat of nuclear annihilation on one or both sides of the border, trying to reduce that threat? Where's the hope going to come from? What are the rays of light there?
Mm-hmm. I try to be, I think of myself as a realistic optimist. So I always try to find some, silver lining somewhere. And so let me point to a couple of factors where maybe it will catalyze changes in thinking. One, I think we're all already the COVID-19 pandemic. Our views of national security need to be adjusted. National security has to also include public health. It has to include employment. These are things that are fundamental to national security, and we're realizing that, or it's being highlighted in ways that I think were convenient to ignore by people who mostly reduce national security to how many guns you have. And so, to the extent that there's realization and recognition in political leaderships in countries, and I would say here also my own, that continuing to invest, particularly in nuclear weapons that can't be used, is not a good investment in national security, and that you have to find other ways to build national security that don't turn on, risk of war and annihilation. So that's one factor I think that we need to recognize. It may be near term, it may take a few years for this to play out. We'll see what the economic effects will be. But I think that there will be a lot of populations that are going to hold their leaderships accountable for how they're spending money. And chest thumping and hyping of foreign threats is not sufficient. People will read through that and see through that, and will hold leaders accountable for a broader conception of national security. That's an analytic point, but it's also a hope. I hope that that's the case, to include in my own country. Second question mark that I have that is maybe a potential turning point. We're entering now a phase of U.S.-China competition that will be much sharper, more global in orientation. I hope that there's a realignment of that competition where there's cooperation, where there's shared interests, and that the competition can be channeled in ways that don't raise risks of conflict. But we'll have to see how that goes. But the U.S. is thousands of miles away from South Asia, but China is your neighbor. China is India's neighbor, and it has interests in India and Pakistan in ways that make it, I think, more oriented towards a stable status quo than other outside powers. Partly that reflects the degree of economic entanglement it now has in both countries, the numbers of Chinese business people, others in both countries, students, etc. And that, I think, has, my sense is that has started to change how officials and analysts in Beijing think about its role in South Asia. Now, I suggested earlier that for me and for many others is still a bit of a black hole about how Chinese policy towards South Asia is made and implemented, and who the important people are and what the priorities are and so forth. But it's changing. And as it continues to change, it strikes me that China will have leverage in both countries that would not just dampen the prospects for war, but might also create conditions and incentives for a lasting peace. Or not, I don't know. But that is something that will change. And with that change comes opportunity.
I think on that note of hope and an opportunity, Toby, I want to thank you for making the time to be part of this conversation. I found it fascinating. I learned a lot, as usual. Thanks so much. And look forward to welcoming you back, hopefully, to talk about some of the hope and opportunity having actualized itself, not in 5 or 10 years, but much sooner.
Yeah. Well, thanks, Musharraf. It's been a pleasure to talk with you. I hope to next time do this in person in Islamabad rather than virtually over Zoom. But hopefully that time arrives sooner rather than later. And until then, be safe and be healthy.